Well, that was during the 80s. Then came another election that we all celebrated. That was the victory in 1994. We took over the, that is, what the conservative Republicans, as we call it, took over Congress. It was said of the so-called, I say so-called Gingrich revolution, that it all started out fine, but when it really started going to pot was, and the corruption began, and the spending began, and that began when Newt left and Tom DeLay came in. But as I point out in the book, the only people with short memories, which is what people like Newt Gingrich count on, will remember the corruption started. We set the standard. They set the standard the first week. Newt Gingrich made his reputation by bringing Jim Wright down because of Jim Wright's book deal scandal. He outdid Jim Wright overnight with a $4.5 million advance contract on his own book. Saw nothing wrong with it. It took Lord knows what to have him finally, well, I won't take that advance. But the culture started right then. The Democrats say culture of corruption. Well, is that Democratic propaganda? No. We called it a culture of corruption when the Democrats had done it for 40 years. The 104th and the 105th Congress, they achieved in 10 years, as it said, what it took the Democrats 40 years to achieve, in terms of the lobbying, corruption, and the type and not to mention, as David pointed out, the profligate spending policies, and the excessive, the Terry Schiavo case is a very good. That's beyond the 104th Congress, but that's where the theocrats came in. And the Terry Schiavo case I mentioned in this book because I think the Terry Schiavo case certainly was a turning point in many people's minds. Here's what I say. This is what Tom DeLay said at the time of the Schiavo case. Terry Schiavo was brought to us by God to elevate the viability of what's going on in America. And here's what I write. In Tom DeLay's eyes, as we might have guessed, God isn't just a registered Republican, but an activist who works up wedge issues to keep the party base engaged. Too bad for Terry Schiavo, but somebody had to take the fall in order to, quote, elevate the viability, unquote, of the Democrats' culture of death. And then I say, pause here to get our political and, more important, constitutional bearings. For a point of reference, no Congress in history, not even the most liberal, loose constructionist Congress of the New Deal or Great Society eras, ever considered ordering the federal courts to take jurisdiction over an individual case involving powers reserved to the states. And they just didn't do that. They ordered the federal court, and for the first time, the federal court said, we don't want the case. It's a state case. No, you have to take it. And we have a president flying back from Texas to sign the thing, to sign the bill. So we order the federal court, they order the federal court to take the case, and then when the federal court's in strict construction, they said, no, it's for the first time a federal court, not the first time, but a rare time a federal court says we don't take. DeLay and the rest of them lacerate the courts. They're outraged. That has nothing to do with constitutionalism. That has nothing to do with separation. That has nothing to do with what we call conservatism. That is where the religious right entered into, and that's where the theology enters into politics. It's not a question of separation of church and state in this case. It has to be a separation of church and politics. Then came with the Bush administration in 2000. I said there was elation on many of our parts. Certainly we celebrated taking over the White House. But with that, people ask, well, what happened to George W.? What happened to Dick Cheney? Brent Scowcroft says I've known Dick Cheney for 30 years. I don't know Dick Cheney now. I think there are many of us who feel the same way. George W. is another mystery. I knew George W. when he was the governor of Texas. And the strength as governor of Texas was of his ability to understand the democratic process. When I went and visited him some years before he came to Washington, he said, every Monday I get together with the Democratic leadership and we work things out. And I say, when they want to push me too far, I say, no, I'm not going to go that far. And we understand each other. That's why he was reelected without even any, the Democrats themselves didn't put up any opposition. What happened to that, George? And that was also with George W. Bush, who stayed almost daily in contact with his father. This George W. Bush doesn't consult with his father. This is not simply, some people have said, Freudian, there's something Freudian going on. There's something Shakespearean going on. I mean, there's some sort of tragedy. What happened? Well, I don't like playing around with psychobabble and that type of stuff, but it's obvious to me, and it was obvious at the time, that Don Rumsfeld, George H.W. Bush had no greater enemy in American politics than Donald Rumsfeld. When Cheney persuaded George W. Bush to put Donald Rumsfeld in as Secretary of Defense, and he put him in there, as I point out in the book, because to bottle Colin Powell up, and they did, they bottled Colin, not that Powell was any hero in my book, as if you read it you'll find out, but when that was a signal right off the bat that there was no, there was something different going on with George W. Bush. It was not the George W. Bush that we knew. The war in Iraq, the influence of the neocons, all of that was brought up. You remember, when George W. Bush ran, we were against nation building. He was against nation building. It was Cheney who brought in the Bernard Lewises and the Sharonskys. And I called George W. in the book a weak president. You may have seen, I said, I'd see Dan Quayle in cowboy boots. The fact is, he is a weak president. I worked for 2 vice presidents. And I can tell you, never have I known a vice presidential office have, first of all, look at the size of the staff. There is a shadow staff over there. Cheney's got a staff that's as large and as influential, more influential in some cases, than the White House staff. Am I going on too long here?